What's up? Welcome, everybody. Jordan Peterson, it's time to finally do an analysis that goes in depth. And the reason we're doing this, a couple reasons, we get that out of the way at the beginning. We're not doing it because of a hatred of Jordan Peterson. Not doing it to go after. Not doing it for any other reason than this, which is when I go out and do events, when I meet live individual people, live and in person, not the unalived people that I meet, when I meet the live people versus the unalived people. When I go out and I meet real existing people, I hear all the time, hey, I got into your stuff through Jordan Peterson. Hey, I got into Orthodoxy through Jordan Peterson and you. I got into Orthodoxy through you, Jonathan Pajot, Jordan Peterson. So I think it's time to kind of finally dive in to see what he's all about. And we're going to start, I think, from the places that would be most natural, which would be the two courses. It's kind of a giant corpus, actually, of information. Personality and its Transformations is the title. And then it's a course on personality, which I assume is one of his, it looks like one of his college classes. I think he calls it Psychology 2 something in the lecture series. But however, that lecture course ends somewhere about, I don't know, a lot of lectures in. I mean, this goes 21 or 22, and then it starts over. I don't know if that's a whole other course. We're gonna find out. It looks like it's the same course retaught, maybe. But there's other courses then kind of stacked on top of that. So there's a good 72 entries here. So I don't know if it's just him reteaching the same one. If it is, what we'll do is switch over to Maps of Meaning, which is one of the other courses which he taught at Harvard or Yale. I don't remember where he taught Maps of Meaning, but we'll do that one as well. Depending upon how this one goes when it gets into repetition, if it does. So we want to understand where somebody's coming from in depth, right? And I know that it's always annoying to me when people don't adequately represent what my position is. Now, you might say, but didn't you do a critique video in 2017? So 6 or 7 years ago now, almost. Yes, and I think that everything I said in that video still holds up, mainly due to the critique of classical liberalism. So the arguments that I heard in a lot of the public discourse at that time from Dr. Peterson, covering the topics of, the gender issue, the social issues of transitioning, the pronouns. And I think everybody knows Jordan Peterson from kind of being blasted into the public sphere on a massive superstar scale, initially from the pronoun stuff. And there were those early kind of news clip debates, and there were some debates with feminists and the BBC feminist debate, which got like 30 million views. And so everything kind of like stacked up. And due to the fact that 2016-17 was around the time when I was really kicking into doing what I do full time, I didn't have a lot of time to go through other people's course lectures, unless I set aside time to do it and then, make that part of the content that I put out. So given the fact that I've heard so many times that, your information and Jordan Peterson's information and Jonathan Pajot's information has led people down the path of orthodoxy, I think it's time to finally dive in and see beyond the surface level of what people say Jordan Peterson says. And I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and go into the course. And I'm at this point about 8 or 9 hours in. I've got a lot of notes. And again, I intend to eventually finish the entire course and then move on to the other courses that are out there. And these are from the first set is 2014, and then maybe it's redone in 2015. So we'll see if it's new information or the same information. And the Maps of Meaning is from like 97. And maybe we'll do the Bible lectures. I don't know. I'm afraid that would be the worst. That would be the most difficult part, is to do that part. But another reason we're doing it is because as I was covering red pill people and material and content and arguments, I was starting to notice overlap. And there is an overlap because Jordan Peterson's period of kind of coming onto the scene did overlap with some of the older red pill manosphere material. There's not a total overlap, but when it comes to giving a voice to what people call incels, Jordan Peterson speaks to those people, to that segment. When it comes to specifics like hypergamy, Jordan Peterson affirms that. And so and he affirms that because of evolutionary psychology and biology and the studies in that field. And by the way, I just had a evolutionary psychology professor on today. This is my third live stream today. I did 2 interviews already. We'll try to get that up later. You say, well, wait a minute. Don't you critique evolutionary worldviews? I do. Because the philosophy of everybody having a single line of origin from a single cell organism is not identical to studying a species or the domain of human adaptation. So those are different things. Now, most people in the field of evolutionary psychology and biology believe that everyone comes from apes, but that does not necessarily follow. And so I do believe that human adaptation is real. I believe that natural selection is a thing. And so we can absolutely learn from and study these topics, and we should. So hence why I had Professor on today. That interview is not up yet. So also, I think we should mention that Dr. Peterson comes from the clinical perspective. So he is a clinical psychologist by trade, but he also is a student of other domains that overlap with that, like psychoanalysis, Carl Jung, constructivism, behaviorism. Right? I think he studied all of these fields, but his academic field where he's published is clinical psychology. So he takes that pragmatic data and brings it into his approach to today's cultural issues. So before we get into the actual content of the lecture, again, I'm pointing out this has nothing to do with, personal issue. There's not anything like that. I've never had any interactions with Dr. Peterson. I've had interviews and chats with Jonathan Pajot. And so we've had good conversations, really good chat we did, I think 2 years ago on symbology and symbolism. So there's no drama. There's no anger. It's not coming from a place of envy. Again, it's coming from that place of, all right, well, I want to see what the actual whole corpus of the material is saying here. And as philosophers, as you know, we are trained to know the opponent's or the other person's position, even if they're not an opponent. Maybe they agree 99%. Well, I still want to know their position. If somebody strikes a chord with the culture, I want to know what it is. I want to know what they're saying. And again, I was joking when I said I've heard 5,000 times that I got into orthodoxy from you and Jordan Peterson. I probably heard it 500 times, but not 5,000. I was joking. But I probably heard it 500 times in the last 5 years. So, so let's take a look in depth and see what are the pros, what are the cons, where do we agree, where do we disagree. Let's be as objective and fair as possible. Strive for objectivity. Perfect objectivity is not possible to a human being because our interpretation is theory laden, but we're going to try to give the benefit of the doubt. We're going to be as fair as possible, and I'll give my analysis, hence Jay's analysis. So the other thing I would say is that there's a couple things I've noticed that I think are a source of his popularity. One of them was you had, like Kotel has pointed out, at the same time as the Trumpy phenomenon was going on the rocket sphere, Peterson was kind of there at the same time. And so those things were kind of concomitant as well. People were first looking into alternative information, and the quote gender debate became a huge deal, and pronouns became a huge deal, and on and on and on. And we've only seen all of that ramp up. And then, as everybody knows, then we get the Tate brothers coming on the scene, 2 or 3 years ago, them rocketing to the top. And what I think, setting aside all those people, what this suggests, just as in terms of popularity, is people looking for answers to fundamental things. Daddy figures, mommy figures, and socio-sexual relationships between men and women. Those are the basics. So we're back to basics. People are now trying to question and figure out the basics, things that in the 1940s all of our grandparents would have taken for granted. Nobody would be questioning what's the role of a woman, what's the role of a man. Everything was clear. Now everything is unclear and up for grabs. And so when people have a degree of age and wisdom, and of course Dr. Peterson does come from the boomer generation, so they were going to see some of the blind sides, the blind spots of the boomer generation in this critique. Not saying he's bad because I'm just saying this is my analysis, my opinion, my take. I don't hate all boomers. It's just a joke that I've done for years. It's kind of a shtick. It's not an actual hatred, so people calm down. And no, Jordan Peterson is not going to occupy and become my whole channel. This is not going to become an anti-Jordan Peterson drama channel. But it is time to do it, again, because as I was researching and going through all the red pill people and the manosphere stuff, obviously Jordan Peterson comes up a lot. If you watch Rollo's videos and Rollo's argumentation, Jordan Peterson comes up. If you get into Tate talks and hear them, and they talk about Michaela and Jordan Peterson. So, Jordan Peterson hasn't gone away. He's only kind of gotten more and more prominent. So I think that it doesn't matter what our views of him are as an individual or what we're gonna need to look and see what he's saying, is what I'm trying to say. And I want to do it from an objective perspective, because I know that it's really annoying to me when people critique what I talk about, and I can tell they haven't actually heard, or they don't know what I'm talking about. They never listen to what we say. They hear some drama or some claim of something I said 10 years ago, and there we go, now he's a bad person and we can count him off. That's really annoying. It's just super lazy, super passive-aggressive approach. And, I'm kind of I got that dose of Spurgtism in me. I'll go and watch the whole course, right? And I'll take 50 pages of notes. So I've already got about 10 or 15 pages. So let's get into it. Again, one other point. Why is he popular? Because I think he's bringing data from evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. So the science domain gives it credibility, gives it stature. Rather than talking about outright religious beliefs, it's about the symbology behind various religions and comparative religions. So that has an application to the archetypal structures that are used in psychology, particularly Carl Jung. So that's part of the reason for the popularity. And, being a boomer, he does have a kind of a father figure image that can then speak to incels or, young men who don't have father figures. We have a generation of guys with single moms, et cetera, et cetera. So I think all of those things contribute to the popularity, as well as the culture debates in regard to pronouns and all this kind of stuff. So all of that kind of combines to have produced the popularity that we see. So let's get into the course, because it's structured as it's typical college course lecture series, and it's the psychology of the human person. And I think this is good because I don't know if he said this. Somebody said, hey, Dr. Peterson has said nobody's ever fully done a critique from the basis of maps of meaning and the psychology courses. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the areas where we agree, areas where we disagree. Now, you've already heard me in the past few days when we're covering red pill stuff, already kind of give some ideas as to where I stand on some of these issues. For example, commonalities in the red pill manosphere. Well, a lot of red pill manosphere people turn to evolutionary psychology and biology and point out the studies of, for example, virtuous victimhood and virtue signaling as virtuous victimhood, dark triad personality component, right? That paper that we've covered already multiple times. I think that's something that would be common amongst a Petersonian critique. We see critiques of what some might call the feminine aspects of society, such as the idea of fairness, equalitarianism, the avoidance of harm as a goal of society versus the search for truth. Those, I think we could fairly say, are classically feminine traits. And I think Peterson, when he gets into that, when he gets into female strategies of reproduction, mating strategies, hypergamy, he will source and cite a lot of information from the red pill sphere that red pill people agree with, manosphere people agree with. And that could be manosphere people who are incel and manosphere people who are pickup artists, manosphere people who are just men's rights activists, right? It resonates across all of these niches and subsets. There are commonalities that we find with critiques of radical equalitarianism. This, of course, leads Peterson to often critique Marxism, socialism, sure. The red pill does as well. But as we noted in my critique, one commonality we see is that whether it's Dr. Peterson or whether it's almost all of the red pill sphere, the commonality there is classical liberalism. And so we did a critique of that on my own yesterday or the day before, and then we did another critique of that with Jim Bob. So if you missed those two streams, we got into that there. So those are some of the commonalities. Let me see if there's anything else that I noticed that was a commonality. I don't think so. So let's get into, another example of commonality between red pill sphere, manosphere, and the Jordan Peterson sphere would be some of the ideas about masculinity and femininity. For example, the idea of, Peterson often criticizes men or people or societies where you produce too much agreeableness, right? So if you have a men in society who are too agreeable, then your society's weak, right? And so we need this confrontational element that men have, the desire and the ability to be confrontational. And I think Rollo is correct to point out that a lot of the tradcon sphere and the normie sphere who like that idea, they then turn around and say, well, but don't actually become a person who wants to actually go fight people. Don't actually engage in debates with people. I just want to give verbal credence to not everybody being completely agreeable. And then I'll shout down toxic masculinity when it suits me, right? Which I think he's correct to point out that they give verbal credence to this, but is this really what they want? So Peterson raises the questions as he begins his lecture about, classic problems of philosophy that overlap with psychology. And I don't know how familiar he is with philosophy. In fact, as I go through the course, like I said, I'm on the fourth lecture. I'm about 8 or 9 hours in. I sense a lot of philosophical nods and references, but I don't really think there's a lot of philosophical depth. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that as a person who's a philosopher, right? Coming from that domain, that's my background. That's the training I have. I hear some overlap and some references, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not right, they're not clear. And one of the big gaps, as you know, if you watch the other streams, is we're not going to have much of a understanding of metaphysics. It's almost like, let me do and use everything from philosophy, and we'll do a lot of ethics, but anything that has to do with actual metaphysics, ontology, etc., we're not going to go there. However, we're going to do a lot of using the terms. We're going to do a lot of talking about potentiality, chaos, the good, order, logos. But we're never going to talk about those philosophical terms and their philosophical context. And that's going to be a huge blind spot. And I'm not trying to be unfair. I mean, again, I understand he's not a philosophically trained person. That's fine. So he begins this discussion by ironically raising a philosophical question. So the psychology course begins with the question of what is the self? What is a person? And what is identity over time? How do we have a person having the same identity, picking them out as the person Bob, the person Jordan, right? The person Ricky, whatever, Ricky, Bobby, Billy, Johnny, whatever. What is it that is the same over time? And that's just the classical problem, ancient philosophy of identity over time. And how do we account for change, right? Famously, Aristotle was one of the earliest attempts through the four causes of Aristotelian philosophy to account for identity through change. Being and stasis, right? Becoming, stasis and becoming, being and becoming. And so that's what he says he's interested in. But what's, again, amazing is that the question is raised in a philosophical context, but it's not going to be solved in a philosophical, it's going to be solved in a comparative religion mythico sense. Now, I don't have any problem analyzing or looking at the person and its structure. And we're actually going to see that he does think that you can kind of map out structures of the human psyche, right? And he'll liken it to a tree. He'll liken it to certain ancient archetypal deities. He'll liken it to a computer with different base layers and programming layers in a computer. So I don't have any problems with those analogies or and all that. And maybe when we get to the end of the course, he will be more philosophical. It's just interesting that the question is raised in a philosophic context, but then it's only discussed in a religio-mythico-symbolic way and not in a philosophical way, at least so far. He brings in the question of virtues and vices. He calls them virtues and faults, I think. And again, this is relevant because this is Aristotle, right? This is virtues and vice, virtue ethics. We're thinking of Aristotle, Nicomachean ethics. And he raises, he sort of lists out different personality characteristics. The extrovert, neuroticism, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness. And he points out that you've got to have a little bit of these and their opposites to be a balanced person. That's going to set the stage for his whole model of balancing everything between the two poles, right? So, for example, you can't be too extroverted or you'll be, annoying and you'll be this sort of loudmouth or something like that. But if you are the opposite of that, too much introverted, then you're going to be a creep in the corner who never talks to anybody and people are going to think you're weird. So between extroversion and introversion, there should be some sort of polar balance, right? And again, this is going to set the stage for his later on models of Osiris, Isis, and then Horus as the middle mediating balancing pole. It's going to be the structure that he sets up later with the yin and the yang and the balance being the middle. And so he says the same thing, right, with neuroticism, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness. They also have their corresponding, quote, vices. So it's almost like taking Aristotle's virtues but turning them into personality characteristics and then pointing out that you need the golden mean, right? And in Aristotelian ethics, that's the golden mean is the balance between the two extremes. For example, again, for Aristotle, courage is the middle pole between foolhardiness and cowardice, right? So you are called upon to defend your household and you are a coward and you don't do it, and that's the opposite extreme, but you're not going to rush out there and try to fight everybody who comes into your yard. That would be foolhardy, right? You want to find a balance of what it is to be courageous between these two extremes. Some people also, by the way, out there will make accusations and theorize. I don't have any theories or proof or any claims that Jordan Peterson is part of a conspiracy. The fact that he wrote some paper, contributed to a paper, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's part of a quote UN conspiracy. He could be a proponent of those views. I'm going to take him at his word because I don't have any evidence or proof that he is part of it per se. Other people express concerns that Dr. Peterson might be involved in helping to create something that might be a future world religion. Don't know about any of that. Don't have speculations. Just going to treat what's in the lectures themselves. It is interesting that he talks about the programs at McGill University, and it is historically a fact that McGill University does have a history of programs. Brzezinski was at McGill. We can think of the classic MKUltra programs. I'm not saying Jordan Peterson is a part of MKUltra at all. I'm just saying that the university system itself can be part of these interlocking higher level systems that individual professors may or may not know about. If you look at the way MKUltra worked, for example, the Human Ecology Foundation was a front. So a lot of people thought they were just doing studies for this, quote, ecology foundation, and the doctors involved didn't know that the Human Ecology Foundation was a front. It was a CIA front, right? So I'm not making personal accusations or judging people's motives. I don't have any information on that. And it annoys me when people do that to me, too. Because once you start to get an audience, then suddenly people decide, oh, actually, now he's part of the giant conspiracy. And usually the reasons that they say this are just the most ridiculous things. Or they found a picture of me dressed up, making fun of metalheads, and they say that I'm dressed up like a woman. It's like, I'm not a woman if I'm wearing a wig and acting like a metalhead. Right? I'm making fun of, that was a video I made making fun of pagans from years ago. And they're like, oh, look, he's a cross-dresser. Yeah, okay, sure. That's not what we're all about, right? That's dumb, and that's low-tier stuff. I'm only interested in his claims. So let's look at the objective arguments. Because I don't need to go into theorizing when I can look at what's objectively stated and go from that. And by the way, the same goes for the domain of, quote, conspiracy theories. Right? In the other streams, you probably heard me fussing about the Tradcon sphere always shying away from, quote, conspiracy theories. When it's like, well, I mean, how are you going to shy away from geopolitics? How are you going to shy away from espionage when literally the news for, 6 years was talking about Russiagate and Russia conspiring? Oh, but we don't talk about conspiracies? Well, that's a fake conspiracy, yeah. But it's still a conspiracy on the part of the media, right? So we're going to stick to the actual argumentation and not theorizing. And so he notes that ancient religious systems are, for him, old personality assessment systems. So he's typically interested in shying away from any metaphysical commitment when it regards the truth or falsity of the positions. So people are, why is he so... Again, I just explained in the first 20 minutes why we're doing this. So if you're new here, you can go back and watch that. I'm not going to repeat myself for you. Because I've had literally 500 people say, I came to Orthodoxy through you and Jordan Peterson, at least. So that's why I'm doing it. So I want to know what his arguments are. So ancient religious systems for him, he says, function at, now I don't know if he only thinks they're this, but he says that they function as personality assessment systems and structuring systems for classifying society, for building society. And he's going to explain how that is. And he said, he gives some examples. He says, he thinks Judaism could be classified psychologically as very closely connected to Freudianism. Carl Jung, he says, is more so closely connected to Christianity, which is odd to me. I'm not sure why that is, because Carl Jung is quite clearly 100% committed to Gnosticism. I've read enough Carl Jung to know that that's pretty easy to verify. And the history of Christianity is pretty distinct from Gnosticism, right? I mean, there's a few overlaps of Gnosticism in the first few centuries, but, Orthodox Catholic Christianity distinguishes itself from Gnosticism very early on. He also says Carl Rogers and Carl Jung are Christian, or that their psychotheology is close to Christianity. So again, I don't know why he thinks that, but maybe later on in the lectures, he will explain why. But he says that what we get from these religious systems is ideas, and the ideas are about the ideals. So from religious substrates and from storytelling, we get these archetypal patterns. This is, again, Jungian, right? I know, I have Carl Jung. I have Carl Jung's essay on Antichrist and Jesus as flip sides of the same coin. So I'm aware. I know what Carl Jung says. I know about the Red Book, right? So I worked at a bookstore. We sold the Red Book. Nobody ever bought it, by the way. It was always behind the counter for $300. No one ever touched it. But I did spend several evenings looking at it. So Peterson says that ancient man did storytelling. And storytelling is maybe better for us as human beings because we connect with that in a better way, a much more natural way, you could say, because humans love and we experience things as stories. Our lives are stories. We read things as stories. So storytelling is going to be a better approach to helping and understanding a human being flourishing than abstractions. And this is going to be the basis, in part, where Peterson moves on to critique post-Newtonian materialist perspectives of the world, right? This is why for him, the shamanic initiation, the shamanic archetype, the hero character, the hero archetype, this is Jung, this is Campbell stuff. Those are going to be better models for classifying and understanding the human person than anything that, for example, Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins would posit, right? So that's where we're getting the relevance to today, you see. This, for example, is why he begins to sprinkle into the lecture his references to Pinocchio. This was odd, too, because pretty early on in the lecture, he starts out with Pinocchio, and it's like, well, why are we going to Pinocchio right away? And I realized that this is another reason why a lot of people in Peterson's audience like what I talk about and what Pajot talks about. And that's because throughout the lectures and throughout, I guess, his other courses, I don't know yet, I haven't seen them, but he typically sprinkles in a lot of movie and story and symbol analysis. And so certain movie clips, certain movie principles, and he really likes the story of Pinocchio a lot. He references it all the time. He sees this as the father rescued from a whale. Now, he brings this up. I don't know where this comes from. And I'm not saying that he's wrong. I'm just saying that I don't know the source of this. Like, rescuing your father, I don't know about this. Again, not that I know all about Catabasis. I know about the descent into the underworld. I know about ancient mythology. I know about Virgil's Aeneid. I know about all that. Okay? I know about the Iliad and the Odyssey. I know about Dante. I've read all those things. Okay? But I just don't know about what the idea of rescuing the father is yet, but maybe we will get there. Maybe we will find later on figures. I haven't read all the works of Carl Jung, so maybe there's places where this is discussed. So I'm going to withhold judgment on what that means, as I'm sure he will later bring this in. But he begins to say, well, in Pinocchio, we have the whale breathing fire, and the whale is this image then of the dragon. It's the giant dragon from the sea. It's Tiamat. It's, Leviathan, on and on and on. So we see that the religio, mystical, symbolic structures of today's pop culture also function well for him to express his view and his system as he is teaching his students. So that's why he's bringing in so many movie analyses and whatnot, which again is, I think, partly why it overlaps with a lot of what we do. Now, he does not do any conspiracy analysis, or he doesn't talk about social engineering, although it is interesting that, there is a whale in Pinocchio that, I haven't watched Pinocchio in forever, but he plays the clip. And I could see why, a psychoanalysis type of perspective would enjoy Pinocchio. But like I said, I am 8 hours in. So this is many, many hours of Peterson, and I'm going through all of them, and I'm working right now from the first course. And maybe rescue, here's my speculation. Maybe rescue the father from the murky chaos of culture, as he says, is a reference to the loss of patriarchy, right? I assume that's what he means, because as he's going to go into his Egyptology section, he's going to describe Osiris and the place of Osiris in society and culture as the father archetype. It is the phallo-logocentric order. And so maybe a society that gets weakened through decadence and equalitarianism, virtue, signaling, victimhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that becomes what we are, basically. It's lost patriarchy, so we're going to have to culturally rescue our father from the chaos of culture. I'm guessing that's what he means, but I don't know where we're going to go, right? Because again, and this goes back to like ancient Neoplatonic stuff, the microcosm is the macrocosm. So what's applicable to the individual as in terms of his inner structure and his psychological development and process is applicable to the culture as a whole, you see. Remember Plato's man? The city is a man. And the whole world and universe is a man. It's a body with a head, right? Maximus appropriates that for Christology, for example. So I'm assuming then that what's applicable to the individual in terms of reorienting his relationship to his father archetype, that's going to be applicable to the social sphere when society is lacking that correct orientation to a father archetype and or God the Father, you see. So, again, I don't know if that's precisely what he means by the phrase rescuing your father, but I do think that given where the course goes, especially when he gets into the Egyptology section, that's basically what he's arguing. So, again, for him, the classical sort of Jungian and Joseph Campbell archetypes are very important. So the hero and the shaman are going to make up an important section of this course. I'm right now finishing up that section right now. So he's going to say that if we think about the shamanic archetype, for example, in society, the doctor, the priest, the scientist, they function in this way. The ancient shaman was kind of like the proto-doctor, the proto-priest, the proto-scientist. And their function was unique because they had this insight. They had high IQ, probably. They had high vocabulary. So the ancient world, the shaman priest class, right? Those are the ones who had the knowledge. And he says that for them, by the way, with this has no reference to Christianity, but I did find this interesting that he said this. He says that for the ancient and primitive societies, verbal and oral traditions were normative, right? And they were highly accurate. So you have people in the ancient world, for example, that were supposed to, the bard or whoever, right? Like he's tasked with reciting, all of the Iliad or whatever, which is crazy. But, and that was much more common in the ancient medieval world. Like you had to know, for example, all of the Psalms, I think, to even go into certain, like if you wanted to enter the monastery, you had to have had the whole Psalm memorized, right? David's Psalms. And Peterson argues that this is interesting because the oral tradition in a lot of these ancient and medieval societies, and even perhaps today in societies that still have oral tradition, tribes or whatever, he says that they are very accurate. So if we want to have this assumption that, traditions can't be passed down because they're oral, this goes against the narrative, for example, of, the Bible can't be accurately produced. He's not making a Bible argument. I am, right? He would say something like, I don't know about that, but I'm saying, so wait a minute. So if the oral tradition can be accurately preserved, even outside of any presupposition of divine guidance or revelation, then wouldn't that apply to the transmission of the Bible? Interesting. He also says that for the shamanic archetype, there is always usually some death and rebirth ritual. Now, I didn't know that he talked about this. I really didn't. This is actually, and it's probably because it's in the comparative religion scholarship of people like Mircea Eliade, right? I remember reading Eliade talking about the commonalities amongst various shamanic traditions and their rituals and rites. Now, how would you have commonalities like that in cultures completely divorced and never having interactions with one another? Right? Why would a shaman in his religious experience and initiatic process in Mongolia be the same as what's going on in like Peru? Right? That's pretty crazy. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that's in the academic scholarly literature, and I've got another book on shamanism, just from the academic perspective, right? And it was saying the same thing. I forget where it is. I think it's up there on the top shelf, but I've read this in the literature is what I'm trying to say, and I remember reading that, hey, wait a minute, this suggests more is going on, right? This can't just be pure social construct or social constructivism to explain the meaning and the pattern behind these rituals and rites, because it doesn't mean the rituals and rites are true. It's saying that how would there be commonalities in the experience? So somebody said, well, it would be common origin. No, but it's more than that, because a tribe in Mongolia that the shaman is doing his rituals and the experience that he goes through when he has his initiation is the same as the experience that the shaman in Peru is having, and they don't talk to one another. So it's more than just a common origin, right? Because I'm talking about the initiatic experience itself, and that's why Peterson talks about psychedelic studies. He's talking about the same thing. I know what he's talking about because it's in Eliade and other scholars of shamanism. So let me give an example. Let me get this book. Yeah, this is it. It's Eliade's History of Shamanism. Okay. This one was a giant Princeton publication. So he points out that there's these commonalities in different cultures, totally different cultures, no known commonalities of the initiatic experience of the shaman. Meaning, when the shaman does the drug trip, he passes out, he goes into the other sphere, the entities disembowel him, dismember him, eat him, and vomit him back up. And then when he comes down from his trip, he's put back together in this death and rebirth ritual. And Peterson says that this is similar to the restructuring of a person's paradigm that occurs when they undergo trauma. So I don't know, and I'm not saying how far he studied trauma-based mind control and hallucinogenic drugs. I don't know that. I haven't read his clinical literature. But what he's talking about is part of the literature. And I'm going beyond the science element, and I'm saying that, no, there's something else here. And he actually says this, I think he hints at this in the debate with Matt Dillahunty when he talks about the research from hallucinogenic drugs, right? And he says, how would these differing cultures that don't know each other at that contemporaneous time, they might have had a common origin thousands of years earlier, but at the year 5000 BC, they don't know each other. How are they having the exact same experiences? And his argument is that there are thus fundamental structures and substrates that we tap into in these trips, or perhaps at all times, because we're just humans are structured this way. So this kind of spills over into Jungian stuff, where the idea is, if you read the discussions and the dialogues and debates that Carl Jung has with the Wolfgang Pauli, and I did one of my first podcasts like 13 years ago, or something like that, where I went into this whole discussion. I read a bunch on this because I found it fascinating. And Wolfgang Pauli is trying to solve some physics problems, and he's talking to Carl Jung, and Carl Jung says, you need to study psychology because that would help you understand the physics problems, because maybe you need to see, I'm just going from memory here, I haven't thought about this in forever, but it's something like, what if the fundamental substrate of reality is psyche itself? All right, that's kind of what Jung posits. And then this, I guess, contributes to Wolfgang Pauli positing part of his quantum physics theory or something, that maybe there's an interplay between our mind influencing reality and reality influencing our mind. And so maybe reality is not completely a projection of the mind or the subconscious, but maybe there's a reciprocal relationship, and maybe fundamental reality is psyche or mind, right? So something in this direction, which, yes, kind of touches on Platonism, kind of touches on pantheism, kind of touches on a lot of different possibilities of what that's Neoplatonism, right? It could be touching on a lot of those things. Anyway, I think this is the domain from which Dr. Peterson is working, and I would imagine that he is very familiar with Iliada. I think I have almost all of his works up there on my shelf. I have the whole trilogy. I have the book on sacred space. I've got this shamanism text. I even have Ioan Culiano's text as well. I think he was his student, right? Anyway, I've not read all of these, but I've got Eternal Return by Iliada. So I have a lot of this stuff. And I was reading a lot of this stuff around the time that Peterson was giving these lectures. Okay, so when Peterson was lecturing on this in 2014, and I'm sure he was lecturing on this before that, I'm not saying he knew this stuff way before I did. I understand that. But I was reading a lot of this perennialist Iliada stuff in about 2011, 12, 13. So I'm just remembering a lot of this from that time period. Now, this is interesting because you might find it surprising that another reason I think that there's overlap with what we talk about and what Jordan Peterson talks about is that he gets into this notion of in the same way that a shaman has his psyche kind of restructured after a traumatic event or after the initiation drug process, human beings, not just through drugs, but from experiences, deaths in the family, all kinds of different things, they can actually have their paradigm shattered. And he actually likens the paradigm shattering to a kind of like a religious conversion or a death, burial, and resurrection. So let's say you are a lifelong Protestant and you are confronted with, I don't know, orthodoxy or something like this, and then you have your whole worldview collapses, right? That's what Jordan Peterson saw. He said, now this is like a rebirth in your life, you see. So he says our new selves are constantly based on our presuppositions, either altering, modifying, or at times even being demolished. And that can be a traumatic process for us, even to the degree that it's like a new death, burial, and resurrection. Now, one of the good points with Dr. Peterson is here, which is that, number one, he understands to a degree. I don't know that he understands it philosophically, but I think he understands that when he hears me or other people perhaps talking about presuppositions and presuppositionalism, he uses this all the time, and he does correctly understand that it means that you are embedded within a context. You are situated, you are, he uses a phrase, I'm trying to remember what it is. It's not embedded, it's another phrase that he uses, but it's basically making the point that our experience is theory-laden. So this is correct. And presuppositionalism is partly predicated on this idea that whenever we understand something in our worldview, it's part of a lexicon of a whole dictionary of things that go together, right? In other words, take a sentence. It doesn't make sense if I just give you one word, right? If we're having a conversation and I say blue, right? Unless you think I'm just some new age douchebag. Blue, man. Right? Just me saying blue, even though we know what blue is, like it doesn't have a context. Blue what? Blueberries? The Blue Man Group? What? So a sentence gives the words context and meaning, right? I want to go see the Blue Man Group. I don't, but you know what I mean. So in other words, the word is embedded within, it's nested. I think he uses the word nested. Nested within a context that's holistic. And so there is, I don't know that he would know what we mean by epistemic holism, but that's essentially what he's kind of getting at. He's understanding that everything is theory-laden and embedded within a context, and that it's presuppositional from the psychological vantage point. But I don't think he understands or grasps that can also be understood and stated in a philosophic sense or in a logical sense, in a transcendental argument, right? That's another domain. Now, maybe he does, because as I'm progressing, and again, I'm only on part 4, so he seems to be understanding Kant or espousing Kantianism, but I don't know if he knows Kant's positions, and maybe he's inadvertently interacting with it, or if he actually understands is he's actually putting in Kantianism. And you'll see why that is when we get to the part where he talks about studying the phenomenological experiences and basically saying that we don't really know. I don't think he uses the word noumena, but he's basically saying we don't know the noumena, we only study and can know the phenomena. But we'll get to that later when he starts speaking that way. So I detect Kantianism, which means that he may understand transcendental argumentation, but let's remember, right, the transcendental argument for God is not Kant's transcendental argumentation. They might have a similar form, but they're different things. Kant does not make a transcendental argument for God. Kant's transcendental categories are just mental structuring features. Okay, they're not they're anti-metaphysical. They're not saying things about what exists, although they kind of are, but that's a different critique. But so this then I think leads Peterson, even though he's not going into metaphysics, to still be anti-relativistic. And so we can say that's a positive. So it's good that at least he's attempting to be anti-relativistic. Whether he ultimately accomplishes that, given the fact that the philosophy here may not ultimately be that consistent, there at least is an attempt to critique and oppose cultural relativism. By the way, if you guys would, you can support the stream via the super chat function, and super chats are through Streamlabs. So we are working our way through Peterson's Psychology of Personality course, the transformation of personality as well, as he calls it. So you can ask me a question or leave a super chat, support the stream there through Streamlabs. This channel was demonetized 5 years ago, and so super chats are via Streamlabs. Next, he points out, which I think is probably one of his main emphases and influences, is Carl Jung. Peterson notes that Jung is, quote, profound beyond belief, And he again notes that he finds Jung to be some sort of grounding basis for his anti-relativism. We'll see that, because I think the next upcoming lectures are Carl Jung. It's either Rogers or Jung, I forget what it is. But he says, our heads are full of devils and snakes and entities. And not all those entities are good. And we are possessed by sub-personalities, say the psychoanalyst. Now, this is where he starts to throw in some of his more interesting elements, which I haven't seen this. Somebody sent me a thing, I think, saying that he has recently said that he does think MPDDID is real. Now, when he says this, I'm assuming that's what he means, and I'm assuming, well, if he studied clinical psychology and hallucinogenic drug stuff, then presumably he knows the literature also dealing with MPDDID. So is that what he's referring to when he talks about the sub-personalities? And for those of you who are in the chat who are like, I'm not trained in psychology, I'm not claiming to be. Okay, again, I studied philosophy. Okay, so if you're citing a bunch of psychoanalysis people and you're saying, oh, he doesn't know, I don't know this stuff because it's not my training. So if you do know these things, then feel free to instruct us, enlighten us, and tell me who we need to be reading and looking at. I welcome anybody's wisdom. I don't know everything, and I'm not claiming to be a know-it-all. So a couple things here. Our heads are full of devils, snakes, and entities. They're not all good. Again, I wonder if he himself isn't sure what the ontological status of the entities are. And is he actually talking about MPDDID studies and or possession? Or would he, so for example, Dr. Colin Ross, who I've read several of his books, he is one of the main clinical people involved in MPDID research. He's published many things on this. For example, I did a whole lecture through his Osiris Complex book from many years ago. Now, he would say, no, this actually is real MPDDID stuff. And supposedly Peterson has a recent thing where he talks about this. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm interested to see what he says. But Dr. Ross does not believe that they are demons. Obviously, I'm not saying all altars are necessarily demons. I'm not sure what all the I don't exactly know what is going on here. I mean, I do think there's demonic possession. I don't know if all altars are necessarily demons, though. I think it might be possible that the person can actually be split through trauma. But Dr. Ross thinks that through evolution, there's these primal aspects of our persona back when we were lizards and monkeys that sometimes manifest. So rather than saying that it's a demon, it's like, no, it's an ancient million-year-old personality coming out of you when you were a monkey, right? So they have this evolutionary explanation for what they think demonic entities that seem to appear in the sessions of the people with MPDDID, because if you've read enough of that literature and the books and the people that talk about that, they'll note that there seems to be a wide array of the personalities or the selves, or what Peterson calls the sub-personalities. And some of them seem to be childlike. Some of them seem to be like weird humans. Some of them seem to be splits of the original personality, of the original person, the core personality, and some of them seem to be demonic. So I don't know. I don't have all the answers to that. I've read many books on this, and I've watched many documentaries on MPDDID, and I don't have all the answers. I don't know. I find it fascinating, but I don't have all the answers or how all that works. But I am interested in what Peterson thinks about all this. And so in the next lecture, he moves on to talk about other archetypal stories, Jonah and the whale, which he likens as to another beast Leviathan, dragon kind of figure. He talks about Jonah's journey into the deep in the belly of the whale. That is actually, as Jesus says, right? As Jonah was in the belly of the whale, Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. In Matthew 12, I think. So he understands that as a Catabasis narrative. That's correct. That's also what Jesus says. Then he talks about other descent into the underworld narratives, this being common not just in the ancient world in Virgil's Aeneid, I think book 6 of the Aeneid, but also in Harry Potter in part 2. Harry goes to the underworld to fight the basilisk. So again, sprinkling in a lot of the pop culture narratives. Interesting analyses that he mentions in passing about things being cast into stone in the ancient medieval world, or the ancient world especially, cast into stone, or this had to do with memory. And that was odd because of sort of a providential synchronicity thing, because right when Peterson was talking about that, I was reading in Summers' text on Old Testament Israel theology, where he was talking about the instances in Genesis where the patriarchs, Abraham, others, right, where they anoint the stones. And what's with this stone anointing? Well, in Summers' analysis, it has to do with divine embodiment and theophanies. And then it was just weird because right when I was reading that, Peterson comes on talking about that you have this notion in ancient society of things being stuck into stone for the purpose of memory, and then it relates to memorization and so forth. He talks about self-deception, and one thing he does, I think it's kind of similar to what I do, is he kind of does stream of consciousness conversation, just sort of spit it all out, right? And I do the same types of things. So a lot of what he talks about is like, we'll tie into all these different things because it's just kind of what's coming into his head. And I'm not criticizing that. I do the same thing. But like, he'll go from that, and then he'll say that we can also talk about self-deception. Humans are really good at deceiving ourselves. I agree with that. Actually, Dr. Bonson talked about that a lot. The underworld is where we find dragons, we find smog, and I think he takes this again to not just be, well, I don't know what he thinks of it spiritually. But I do know if you read like the Emil von Franz and all that, you'll find this in the Jungian scholarship pretty consistently, that the underworld is a reference to the subconscious. So the demons and the creatures that inhabit the underworld are, at least in this scheme, symbolic manifestations in a literary sense, and perhaps an even more real sense, of entities that can well up from within us, you see. And it's not just the individual, it's also the society. So the society can become, in a sense, possessed when the untapped, raw, unnatural, in a way, powers from the underworld come seething up through us and manifest in our consciousness. So when we see these screaming, foaming social justice warrior, purple-haired people-eater people, goblins out there screaming and barking, and that's because this primal underworld dragon thing is coming forth. But remember, Christianity says, of course, that no, this is actually a demonic power. This is not just some ancient evolutionary monkey brain. The monkey brain, right, that the libertarian atheists always talk about. No, it's actually a spiritual reality. It's not just primal drives. And this is one of the big problems that we're going to notice in this system, is that if these are just primal drives, then basically what we're saying is, oh, actually, I need the demons in me, right? I need to integrate my shade self, meaning that I need to have some of that in me. And that's because as we start to move through this lecture series, Peterson will confuse potentia, evil, and chaos as if they're all the same thing. They'll get overlapped and flipped and confused. And so this is an important point. This is why metaphysics matters, right? It makes all the difference in the world if I view my demonic urge to, I don't know, let's say I don't have this urge. Let's say, oh, I have the demonic urge to go kill somebody, right? I hate this person. I want to go get them and destroy their lives. I need to integrate that and because that's now a primal evolutionary drive, right? It's not something wicked and sinful. It's a primal evolutionary drive that I need to integrate into my psyche. I mean, that's crazy. And then when it gets to in extreme cases of, I don't know, self-harm, do I need to integrate that? I mean, you see how silly this gets, right? And that's because we're confusing moral evil with potentiality. And those are different things. But you'll notice he actually identifies them at times. He will actually say that on the right side of the yin-yang is the order, the logos, the structuring principle, the father, and the other side, is the opposite of it, is mother, chaos, potentiality, the unknown, and you have to be situated in between these. And this leads to, I mean, again, let's just see this in Carl Jung. Look at his essay on Aeon. In the Carl Jung Aeon essay, he says that Jesus and Lucifer are two sides of the same coin. You need to integrate and have both Jesus and Lucifer as part of your psyche. You need to be both Jesus and Satan, you see. That's literally what Carl Jung says. You see how this is problematic. And how does he get to this? Because Carl Jung is metaphysically confusing categories. Confusing existing things like woman and knight with moral evil, non-existence, and potentiality. Those are different things. But if I lump all of them together in this dualism, then we get these really bizarre problems, this weird Gnostic stuff. That's where it becomes a problem. And any system that is not going to use metaphysical categories and make metaphysical distinctions is going to have these problems. This is why all the Eastern philosophical systems are wrought with these dialectical problems. That will be the chief problem in Dr. Peterson, which is the failure to understand dialectics in the sense of metaphysical dialectics. I don't mean dialectics in terms of pedagogy. Nothing wrong with dialectical pedagogical instruction. Dialectics as a metaphysical structuring of the universe is a problem. Most Eastern religions are built on this. Gnosticism is built on this. Platonism is built on this. Even Aristotelianism to a degree is built on this. And so we will never, ever see in any of these what are essentially pagan systems, even the ones that are very sophisticated, even the ones that are very advanced, they're never going to be able to resolve these problems. Thus, they will always fall over into either dualism, monism, or pantheism. That's going to be your only options. When you don't make these metaphysical distinctions, the bases of your worldview will spill over into monism, dualism, pantheism. Literally almost all the world religions are those things. And Orthodox Christianity, by the way, is unique in that it is not predicated on dialectics. At least theologically, it is not. So he moves through, other underworld analogies, symbolism of the underworld, how this relates to psychoanalysis, and this is where he gets into the idea of the, what did he call them? The snakes and the entities in us that we also dealt with 10 million years ago when we were monkeys and trees. So in comes all the evolutionary biology and psychology, which is to say then, you have a guttural reaction, an instinctual reaction to squish the snake, to run from the wild beast because 10 million years ago, you were a monkey in a tree and you saw a snake and you learned to freak out, and that's embedded in you because you come from the monkeys, you see. So there is then this appeal to aeons ago where you were embedded with this evolutionary imprinting. Now, where he falls on the side of nature, nurture, I don't know, or a balance between them, I guess we'll find out. I'm assuming he's more on the side of nature than nurture, but we'll see. And this is where he gets more into the notion of katabasis beyond just a religio-mythical thing. He says that katabasis and the descent into the underworld are actually models for what we go through in life, and that we often experience death and rebirth in our life. For example, when we have trauma, that sends us to the underworld. We're close to death, and then we come out of that. Maybe we had a sickness and we got close to death, and we get out of the sickness and we start feeling better. We recover, or maybe we had a death in the family, or we had a bad drug experience and it was a traumatic experience. These are the same as paradigm changes that alter our presuppositions, and these can be traumatic and painful. I agree. That's very true. And that again applies, that's a psychological approach to what we typically highlight and discuss in terms of presuppositional argumentation, how worldviews work, how they're structured, right? A lot of what I'm saying and what we talk about in terms of philosophy, Jordan Peterson, I do think, is hinting at, talking about, and discussing in terms of psychology and mythology. So he is hinting at and is hitting on some of that. Why do we die? We don't know. You basically become a grandfather and then your genetics switches off. It's really bizarre sort of speculations about, maybe science will figure out why we die. I think this is kind of silly. Not that I have a problem with science studying aging and death, just that science is never going to be able to answer that question. I mean, by the nature of what science is. It's a tool for studying the natural world. It is limited. It's not going to give you metaphysical truths. It's not going to give you grand narrative explanations of what happened a million years ago. It can't do that, right? That's theory. That's philosophy. That's religion, which seems like he would know that. But he's at times acts like, no, maybe science will discover why we die, and maybe they can turn off the switches. I don't know where he's going with that, but another one of the criticisms I would have is that a lot of times it seems like he views all this stuff as we're all in the process of system building. So there's not a true religion. There is all the religions grasping for bits and pieces of the truth. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard the analogy of the elephant, right? We're all the religions are blindfolded and they're touching the elephant at different points, right? One of them's on his toe, one of them's on his butt, one of them's holding the trunk, right? And we're all getting pieces of the truth. This sounds really profound or whatever. Now, he doesn't actually use that analogy, but it sounds like that's kind of what he's getting at, because at times he'll be like, well, we just don't know. Well, we don't know. We don't know. Well, we don't know why we die. But it's going to happen, and, it's awful, but it's going to happen, and we don't know. And so the answer is maybe science will figure it out. And then you notice as I go through these, as I listen to more and more Peterson, it's almost like worldviews and systems of thought are all in process, and we're all just kind of looking to the great men. And for him, that's Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Carl Jung, Freud, Carl Rogers, whoever else he likes, right? So we just sort of piece together Piaget or something as best we can, and maybe one day we'll build the meaning structures out of all the religions and all the philosophers and psychologists. So it's an emergent process. So in other words, what's presupposed here is that there's not a religious system that's true. There's not a church that is true. There's not a Jesus that really is Jesus, you see. And this is the big thing. What's missing is that. Is there a personal existing God that is the Logos, that is the source of meaning, truth? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Or is truth what we are in the process of discovering via science, studying evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, comparative religion, perennialism, mythology, Carl Jung, and then we'll like construct some emergent future thing. Another interesting thing he said in this lecture was, how do we figure out what the world is made of? Now, wait a minute. I thought this was a psychology class. Now, I don't have a problem with him asking this question. I'm sorry, that's a philosophy question. That's a question of metaphysics. What is the world? What's it made of? I mean, you could say, well, it's a physics question. But if we say that, it's a physics question, that kind of assumes that, it's reality is only one thing, right? Most people in the physics department are going to say, reality is just matter in motion or something, right? But whatever you think it's made of, to say what is it is a metaphysical question. And then he says that, there's various hypotheses about what the world's made up of, and he says we can approach it from these different vantage points of the objective versus the phenomenological approach. So this is when you start to realize, okay, so he sees a dialectical opposition between what we think of as objective truth, which he identifies with Newtonian science and materialism, I don't know why he thinks that's the equivalent of objective truth. That's bizarre to me. But that's what he thinks. And that's set against the study of phenomenology, or the phenomena as they appear to me, right? Again, going back to Kant. That's the phenomena-noumena divide. And he says that this is essentially the objective versus the subjective. He says that we can also think about the scientific versus the moral perspective, and the materialistic versus the mythological perspective. So objectivity, science, and materialism for him are all equated. Phenomenology, subjectivism, and mythology are the other side of this domain. So I agree with him that you could say that these are kind of extremes. But it is not the case that objective truth is somehow bound up with Newtonian materialism. This is just bizarre. And it is interesting, he goes on to say, reality is information at its ground level. I agree with that. Sounds like what we talk about with information science. Sounds like what we talk about with, when we look at DNA, right? Information. Reality does fundamentally seem to be in some way informational in nature. And that's an argument I've been using for a long time. But he says, but then there's a question of what should I do about it? And this raises the is-ought question. Now, he is correct here to point out, which he does correctly note when he critiques and discusses this with Sam Harris. And we did a video on that maybe a year ago, where Sam Harris still cannot understand this. And I think it's because Sam Harris is a suit. I mean, Sam Harris, just like for many, many years by many philosophers, PhDs, etc., has been asked, you cannot derive an ought from the way things are, right? In your system, the fact that you give an account for reality as purely matter has nothing, there's no logical necessity to say that it ought to be this way or some other way. Now, maybe there are oughts, but being a pure materialist cannot give you an ought. You need more. And that means you're going to eventually, in some way, have to give up the rank materialism. Of course, Sam Harris is never going to want to do that, right? Because that would be the undoing of his whole constructed, made-up narrative that he has of materialism and determinism. So Peterson, I think, accurately does understand basically what the is-ought question is, but this is philosophy, right? This is questions going back to David Hume, okay, and the Enlightenment. So again, to act like I'm not going to talk about philosophy and metaphysical commitments, and then to raise dozens of classical philosophical questions, and even raising them in their philosophical context. For example, determinism versus free will, the notion of all reality being flux, Newtonian materialism, physicalism, phenomenology. I mean, these are philosophical things. And how are we going to talk about these things, raise these questions, and critique these things without getting into... I mean, the is-not question is a philosophy question. It relates to metaphysics. And yet, this is constantly predicated on, I'm not going to get into metaphysics. Why? Because everything in Petersonianism is couched post-Enlightenment. Couched classical liberal dialectics. And that's odd because we're supposed to get these insights from ancient shamanic traditions, which don't have anything to do with classical liberalism. But Peterson's system and point of reference are always couched within everything post-Enlightenment and classical liberal. So there is then this limitation of anti-metaphysics, because classical liberalism is anti-metaphysics. Go back to Hume, Berkeley, Locke, Kant, and especially Kant with the phenomena-noumena divide. We're no longer able to do metaphysics. Kant wanted to solve the dilemma that Hume presented, that we won't be able to do science and metaphysics anymore. And I detect quite a bit of Kantianism or Kantian presuppositions here in Peterson. But again, what is the key element missing here? Metaphysical claims and metaphysical truths. But that's precisely where it's not popular to go, because then we would be saying things that we would have to give an account for that we can't do with pure psychology. Now it would require philosophy. And I'm not being mean or rude or hating Dr. Peterson. I don't think Dr. Peterson understands philosophy. At least philosophy as metaphysics. And that you're bringing in all kinds of metaphysical terms and claims here. And then we get an odd statement. And I don't know if in what sense he means this, but he says, because we can't have universal truths, we only have partial truths. I don't know, how are you going to oppose relativism, which you appear to want to do, and then say we can't have universal truths? That's very bizarre. I mean, maybe he thinks that a universal truth is the equivalent to having omniscience, right? Maybe he's thinking of it like some kind of Cartesian sense that you have to have absolute, indubitable certitude to have any kind of, quote, truth at all. But the question of universals is a metaphysical question from medieval philosophy and the ancient world. And so universal truth claims relate to that, you see. So I think there's a lot of confusion, again, when he starts talking about what he probably thinks are obvious psychological truths, right? Like, can I know universal truth? Well, it depends on what you mean by know, right? Can you have an exhaustive knowledge of something? No. But that doesn't mean you can't have any knowledge of it, right? And that's why, again, philosophy helps us make these distinctions. Then he goes on to say that, but we have in America and in his clinical approach, and I think he even references the philosophicals, he says that we can be pragmatic. Oh, wait a minute, this is philosophy again, right? And remember, he's okay to go into pragmatism because, well, it works. Well, you know what works? Clinical philosophy, or clinical psychology treats people and we do what works. Okay, so what works to do what? To say that it works means that it works towards some end. Ends are telos, purpose. That's metaphysics. Those are metaphysical ideas. If you're going to talk about determinism, free will, if you're going to talk about phenomenology, potentia, causes, those are all metaphysical, philosophical terms. They can't be divorced from that. You can't make those terms into something that are purely psychological. Even if you think it's only psychological, you're still making metaphysical, philosophical truth claims, right? So it doesn't actually solve anything or get us anywhere in terms of truth with a capital T to just say, well, I'm going to do what's practical. I'm going to do what works. Well, as Jim Bob said, I mean, couldn't I use this system to do what works to do something really evil? Could I study all of this, master all of this to become a really effective cult leader? So it works to do great evil? I mean, what's the ends here, you see? I'm not saying he's doing that. I'm not judging motives. I'm just pointing out that just to say something works doesn't tell us anything. Works to do what? To what end? You see how you immediately are involved in philosophical questions, metaphysical questions. Telos or purpose or ends, 100% classic metaphysical topic. He says, well, because I am bothered by the continual dogmatic sort of shoving of the materialist perspective, he says that I want to take the truths of Darwinian adaptation and evolutionary biology, psychology, and figure out what serves life. So when he qualifies what it means to be pragmatic, it means that it, quote, serves life in this Darwinian perspective, so furthering the species and use flourishing, I guess, in a purely biological sense. I mean, this just assumes, is man only purely a biological being? Is he also a psychological being? Is he also a spiritual being? So again, we notice that it's all bound up also with our theological, metaphysical presuppositions, how we're going to interpret anthropology, you see. He says, how are we going to survive, for example, in the face of radical continual transformation in the world? Meaning, he says, is a real thing. And just because meaning is, in his system, subjective to you, doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, because subjectivity does matter. Okay, but that's different from saying that things are only and ultimately subjective, right? Something mattering to me in a subjective sense, and that everything in my worldview is, in some sense, relative to me, does not mean that everything is purely relative, and thus I cannot have universal truths, right? So again, this is a failure to make kind of basic philosophical distinctions, to say that, sure, yeah, subjectivity does matter, but subjectivity does not make everything subjective. For example, the archetypes that you're going to talk about, they're obviously not purely subjective, even though there might be some cultural malleability in some degree. They're still going to be universal, right? So, for example, the archetype of a father, or the father figure, right? He'll look at a bunch of different cultures and say, here's the fatherly logos principle in a bunch of different cultures. It has all these commonalities, so it can't be purely relative, right? So just because, I don't know, Aztec idea of the father, maybe they drew him a little different than Hebrews drew the idea of the father, or wrote about the idea of the father. There's obviously still some commonalities, even though there might be some cultural differences. And that's one of his points as to why pure total relativism is not true. But what something means to me subjectively is a different question than, is everything subjective, you see. I am a subject that has some reference to potentially anything. that doesn't make everything subjective. You see how that's a silly confusion here. So meaning is real. Okay, but what is meaning, right? And maybe he'll get to that in Maps of Meaning. And he says, this is why I'm interested in Darwin trumping Newton. Now, this I think is kind of ridiculous. I mean, number one, we're not in some pseudo battle between a Newtonian worldview versus a Darwinian worldview. And if he can map out what serves the species to serve life, that would somehow prove the Darwinian perspective winning over against the Newtonian perspective. And I think he thinks that the Newtonian perspective presents a machine-like deterministic world where everything is a material object made of dead matter versus a living, moving, existential will to power life in the Darwinian bin over here. Okay, well, these two things are models that do not exhaust the possibilities of what exists, and that's just kind of ridiculous, right? And again, he does not realizing that both of this either or here is bound up with so many kind of wild philosophical assumptions. So in other words, you're not avoiding philosophy by restricting it to Newtonian physics versus Darwinian survival, natural selection. Okay. So this is a false dialectic, and again, it's just not true that somehow objective truth or objectivity is bound up with Newtonian. So before Newton, nobody had an idea of something being objectively true. This is very bizarre. So he couches it as we're going to have either a Newtonian or a Darwinian choice of what is real. Again, false dialectic. Those can be both wrong. They might be right in certain ways or at certain levels, right? Newtonian physics might describe how things work at one level, but not every possible level, right? Only if you're presuppose reductionism would you think that. And by the way, Darwinianism has the same reductionist presuppositions as Newtonianism. So it's a false dialectic. And he says, well, why do I say this? Well, because survival trumps science, and that's pragmatic. Pragmatism and survival of the fittest are not going to answer any of these dialectical, philosophical problems that are raised. And you can't just solve them by saying, well, we're going to do what works. Works to do what? What does it mean to work? Works are towards some end. That's telos. That's metaphysics. And this is all predicated on shying away from and having nothing to do with metaphysics. And he says, well, when we categorize things and we explain things, he says, this also includes the meaning of things. Absolutely, I agree. But Darwinian survivalism is not going to grant you the meaning of things because it's also an anti-philosophical position. It's just a rival grand narrative is all that is. And meaning is a philosophical question. He says, well, clinical psychologists study meaning, and they study this to apply it to the individual's life to help them. He says meaning is tied to action. I don't remember what that is about. Humans are tool manipulating creatures. We are structured such that we have hands to manipulate and to move things, to do things, to create things. Our brains are actually structured to have the hands that we have, which is an interesting point, which seems to me like that would suggest design. I'm not making a basic bitch design argument, but there is design in the world. And it seems to me that if he's arguing that the brain is structured such that it works with the digits that we have, then that suggests design, doesn't it? But I don't think anywhere in this system there's a notion of intelligent design per se. Maybe he believes that. I don't know. I haven't gone that deep into it. Maybe we'll find out later what he thinks about the notion of a designer or whatever. But we seem to see this throughout. Another area, he flips over into philosophy, which, for example, he says that there is an intimate relationship that's reciprocal between the perceiver and the object. This is actually, again, not dialectical. I don't know how he thinks that he's kind of gotten beyond the Kantian divide. Maybe he thinks that Kant had some answer. Maybe he thinks that there is no divide because our mind structures reality, which to me would lead to solipsism. But I mean, if I recall, I think Carl Jung says that, right? Doesn't Carl Jung have some view that the quote external world is actually just a projection of our inner world? Which to me should lead to solipsism. To me, Kant's position should lead to solipsism, but I don't know. However, there is I don't know if he's intentionally referring to Action and Perception by Alvin Noé, which is a famous philosophical book. But one of the points that Noé is making in that book is that we're not just blank camcorders like, Locke thinks that, we just receive all the exterior impressions and we're a bundle of our impressions, like Hume said. We're actually a perceiver that's active in perception. So hence the book Action and Perception. There's a reciprocal relationship, is the thesis of that famous philosophical book. So maybe he's referring to that. I'm not sure. But he seems to, again, have this weird idea because he says in this is lecture 2 at some point, he says, the Greeks didn't posit objective truth. Where is it? I don't understand where he's getting this. This is totally false. And it seems to be because he's somehow, somewhere convinced that the notion of objective truth is connected to the idea of material objects and that's Newtonian. What? No, I guarantee you, if we resurrected Plato and Aristotle from the dead and we asked them, do you think that there's objective truth? Do you think that doesn't mean it's not tied to Newtonian objects? It's not true. It's nothing to do with believing in dead matter. Okay? You can believe that all reality is idea, like Plato says, and still believe that it is absolutely, unquestionably the case that 2 + 2 is 4, and that will not ever not be the case. Okay? So, but maybe he's going to come back and say, well, I don't mean objective reality in that sense. I mean, there's no such thing as objective reality that isn't based on some perceiver. So at times he seems to speak in that way, which sounds like a kind of phenomenalism, like phenomenology in a strict sense of like, whatever I'm not immediately perceiving actually doesn't metaphysically exist. Okay, some people go in that direction. If you go in the direction of Berkeley, that's actually the way that Berkeley goes with it, right? Which is pretty wild. This gets into that goofy Far Eastern philosophy stuff. Oh, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there, what did it happen? Yeah, it did. Okay, because reality is not dependent on perception. Now, if you want to make a divine conceptualist argument, you could argue that it's dependent on the divine perception and the divine mind. You could go in that direction. But that doesn't mean that the events are the divine mind, by the way. They're distinct. Just like I'm not identical to the logi of me, right, in the divine mind. The logi are not the essences of creatures. Different things. The essences of creatures are created essences, you see. The logi are not creatures. They are in the divine mind. There's nothing in the divine mind is divine. It's not a creature. So this is another area where metaphysics is very important. Anyway, last point here. We'll get to the super chats. If you guys would, please support the show via the super chat function. And we will, in part 2, for subscribers, I will give you my analysis and critique of his take on Jungian archetypes, and particularly not strictly the ones like you might think, the father archetype, the old woman archetype, the sage archetype. No, Jungian archetype analysis, but he's going to pick out Osiris, Horus, Set, and Isis. So we're going to look at how he interprets those things. I'm going to give my critique of that, where I think is right, where I think is wrong. He's going to actually get into his discussion of guided drug trips and psychotherapy. He's going to talk about how Mary and God the Father and Jesus fit into his schema here of mythico world religious symbology. And then he'll talk about dividing it into these two poles, yin and yang, and the middle pillar between the two polar oppositions. And then we'll get into, that'll probably be the next public lecture, will be the Tree of Life stuff. So there is going to be some interesting, fascinating symbology coming up. But last couple points he makes is that I agree here. Humans are embedded or nested within a context or a web of meanings. Absolutely agree with that. Reality and truth are theory laden. However, that does not make truth purely culturally relative, right? Which is where I'm concerned with. For example, you read Spengler. Spengler would say that he would say, "Oh, the Greeks didn't believe in the notion of objective truth because that's Newtonian." That sounds like a Spenglerian idea, right? So everything is actually historically and culturally relative, even for Spengler. Well, that to me, that's silly. And if that is the case, then you as a modern Western Faustian man can't read or understand the ancient Greek culture because you're not in the ancient Greek culture, right? So you literally couldn't even talk about it if this was the case. Furthermore, the whole idea that the archetypes are universal is undercut if everything is purely historically, culturally relative, which is where, to me, it seems like this position would go. So we're gonna have to give up something here, right? Personality theory is a sub-element of clinical theory, he says. We're looking for the ideal, which is to find the normal between the extremes. So health and mental health are looking for the ideal and for the normal between extremes. This is, again, the Aristotelian element of the golden mean we mentioned earlier. The male mind is a butt calculator. That's a joke I was making to Jamie, and it's because he was like making a passing reference to like something like, well, you see a woman and she walks by them, the male mind's already calculating what she is and whether she looks good or not. It's like, okay, so the male mind's basically a butt calculator. Okay, mental health is philosophical engineering, I think is something he said. Scientific knowing is not the only way of knowing. Absolutely agree with those things. So those are good points. All right, so in part 2, we'll get to the breakdown of the Jungian archetypes and Christological symbology, where he's wrong on that, the yin and the yang and all that, the two poles and the middle pillar. If you want to support the show, you can do so via the Streamlabs link, via Super Chats there. Gil Bates says for $1, what if you do the right thing for the wrong reasons? Well, it depends on what the thing is, right? So, that's the $1 million question, right? So really depends on what it is. But I wouldn't say that necessarily makes you justified, right? Because sometimes the reasons why we do things can be really important. Jesse Branch, $5. Dang it, YouTube didn't even tell me that this stream started. I'm glad that I caught it early. Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Jesse Branch. Guys, remember that we do support toxic masculinity over here at Jace Analysis. And one of the best ways that you can up your toxic masculinity is by heading over to chalk.com and getting a hold of the Tomcat Ali, which is proven in peer-reviewed studies over at Chalk. You can read them at chalk.com, CHOQ.com, to boost testosterone. Go read those studies. We believe in the clinical science of chalkology. Right? So chalk can absolutely boost testosterone. Use the promo code J50, that's JAY50, to get 50% off all those products over there, including the Tomcat Ali, as well as many other great products like the Action 2.0, like the 7 Wonders. If you're looking for something, for example, to make up for the mineral deficiencies in our diets, 7 Wonders is a great additive for that. Love that stuff. What else have we got over here? She Legit. Jamie loves She Legit. She takes it all the time for mental focus, clarity. If you're going to do a lot of reading, She Legit's a great thing to do. But remember, promo code is JAY50. That's J50, 50% off all Chalk products. That is the show sponsor, and they are an excellent, amazing, based red pill company. And they've been our sponsor for 2 years. We love Chalk.com, and I think you will too. Also use the promo code J53Life if you want to get those recurring subscriptions going. Maybe you're a lady and you're watching this, saying, well, I don't need testosterone, but maybe I've got hormone imbalance. Well, guess what? They've also got products that are great for that. The Irish Moss, for example. If you head on over to Chalk.com, you'll see that there's stacks for men and stacks for women. So you can actually find what's appropriate for you, for if you're a guy or a girl. And I think you will be happy with what you get. Test it out if you want with the promo code J50. But if you like it, you want to get it recurring, use the promo code J53Life. That's J53LIFE to get 53% off all recurring subscriptions. Palantir, $2. When Jordan Peterson speaks of integrating the shadow, I think he often means this is in the context of acting virtuously, knowing that one has the capacity for evil, as opposed to a fake virtue where you wear a mask for cowardice and harmlessness. Do you have any thoughts on this, Jay? Well, again, I've not gotten far enough into the course yet to know where exactly he's going to agree or disagree with Carl Jung. Let's look at our course here. So when does Jung come up? So next up is Piaget. I have read some Jean Piaget and his constructivism. And then we get to two-part series on Jung and Freud. So we got Jung and Freud. So, I'm a few lectures away from Carl Jung. So I don't exactly know what Peterson specifically thinks of integrating the shadow. And so you could be right. So maybe you're right that that's what he means. I'll defer to you if you're a older initiate into the Petersonian mysteries than me. Kevin Farrell, $20. Great talk. Thank you, Kevin Farrell. Much appreciate that super chat there. Palantir at $150. Peterson's lectures are fascinating as they appear to reintroduce the notion of metaphysics into public discourse, while at the same time avoiding metaphysics. Yeah, I do think that whether he intends to do that or not, he's sneakily doing that. So if that's like a sneakily cunning thing that he's doing on the down low, okay, we'll go for that. The archetypes are real, but have questionable ontological status. Yeah, exactly. Now, if he wants to raise the question and sneakily do it, I'm happy to let the people come on over here who want to get the questions answered as to whether metaphysics is real or not, right? $405. There's an open church-going Christian at my workplace, and he's grouchy and rude. What do you think about responsibility to represent Christ in public? How does it relate to our general demeanor? Not commenting on you, I understand the channel. Well, I don't know what kind of Christian that person is also matters, right? I mean, we got churches filled with people who aren't anything. So the fact that he's a, quote, church-going Christian in our day and age can mean absolutely nothing at all. In fact, in terms of Christ's day, the Pharisees were the worst human beings alive, right? Jesus has the harshest things to say for the Pharisees, and we can apply that to today to say that the church-going Christian, in many cases, can be the wickedest person alive. So keep that in mind. Do we have a responsibility to represent our faith in public? Sure. Cossie, $5. I am an hour in. You are doing great work. Thank you so much, Cossie. Do you mean an hour into this talk? Or do you mean an hour into the Peterson talks? Rachel Wilson, $5. This kind of deep philosophical stream is my favorite thing to watch you do. It is second only to watching you collecting slow boy scalps in the debates. Thank you. Well, thank you, Rachel. I'm glad you enjoy it. I thought it'd be a good kind of detour because I am getting in the habit of enjoying daily live streams, and partly because it's gotten to the point now where pretty much almost every day there's at least 2 or 3 interviews I do. So I'm doing 2 to 3 podcasts a day, And if I'm going to keep up my own podcast and talks and channel or whatever, I'm going to have to integrate just having my own talk in there as well. So as you guys know, I like to change it up. I can't do the exact same thing every day. If I sat here doing only movie analyses, I would get sick of movies. And I assume you guys would too, right? You get be like, all right, this guy was, here he goes, movie analysis again. I can't just sit here doing debate streams, right? I get tired of it. So I always like to integrate and test out, new stuff, new topics. I've been wanting to integrate more psychology stuff for a long time. So I am also really enjoying doing a lot of the red pill analysis, manosphere content too. So, we're collecting new topics, I guess you could say, to integrate into the cycle. Well, Emmanuel, $5. Thanks, Well, Emmanuel. Thank you for your $5. Terry, 77, $10. I'm not sure how he could have any sense of universal if everything is contextualized. Well, hold on. So to say that everything is embedded or nested is just a feature of everyone's worldview. It doesn't mean that everybody contextualizes it in a subjective way and none of them overlap. Okay, two different things. Now, he might think that everything is contextualized only by the subject. That's not what I think. But we'll have to see where he goes. You will enjoy Peterson's interview with Hamza Yusuf. Let me write that down. By the way, for those that are curious, we did do a lengthy analysis of the Mohammed Hijab Peterson Pajot talk, and we also did a critique of Tate in that stream as well some months back. So we actually covered that, got about 40 or 50,000 views, by the way. So we have discussed these things in the past. And by the way, I did a critique of the Petersonian classical liberalism. I did 2 streams previously critiquing this. One of them was 5 or 6 years ago, and then one of them was 3 years ago. Okay, so this is not a topic. We don't cover this all the time. Somebody said, why is this always being covered here? No, it's only recently. Hamza Yusuf is a classical Muslim. Yes, I am aware of him. I've not watched this interview. During the interview, he seems to suggest that Peterson does not have and then you get cut off. So, sorry, Terry77. Like, when I see it on Streamlabs, it only allows so much text. So I don't know where the rest of the comment is going with that. But I'm assuming you're saying that he doesn't have any kind of objective, sort of universal claim, and that would be a good critique, and I would agree with that critique. Robert Smith, $3. Objective understanding of God as not a structure of the mind. Agree with that. Exactly. God is not a mere abstract mental structuring feature. He's not an abstract self-help concept that gets you towards your goals. Everything, ultimately, the big question is, who is God? Right? Is it an it? Or is it he? You see, those are big questions. Maps of meaning. Great name there, because that would be me, right? So you got Jordan Peterson. Dr. Peterson does maps of meaning. If you're coming over here, maps of meaning. Exactly, because I'm the meanest man on the internet. I don't have a question, he says. Gilbait says for $1. Wow. What if you join the right church for the wrong reasons? Yeah, I would say that that's not a good thing to do. Now, maybe in the long run, God you might get good motives, but that's a different question. So, let me give you an example. So, when I first went to a Bible study when I was 18, I was kind of interested in the Bible and what it talked about. But main reason I went to the Bible study is because there was cute girls there. Okay, so I didn't have good reasons. It wasn't either or, right? Like, I was like, yeah, okay, I'm interested in the Bible or whatever. Okay, sure. But I wasn't mainly going there just because of, like, I wouldn't have, if the Bible study was only ugly fat chicks, I wouldn't have gone there probably, right? Right. But later on, as I got more into the topics, I got interested in things for the right reasons. So God can fix that, but you still should have good reasons. Tenfold Hat Girl, $5. Have you gotten to the part where he talks about mythical reincarnation? I have not yet. So, again, I'm on the last part of Hero Shamanic Initiation. And then we have Piaget and Carl Jung and Freud and Carl Rogers. So I've not gotten to any reincarnation yet. I don't remember when he talks about this, but it's very perennialist. I would think that that makes sense. In fact, the guy that called in, what's his name, AC, that called in the other day, who had a lot of good comments. By the way, he will come on. We're going to do a stream because he knows all this stuff really well. He was into this for like 10 years. He knows it way better than me. AC, he's the guy saying that we need to discuss Henri Corbin. What did he say? This guy? And that's he's like a Sufi guy. So if we're talking about Sufi stuff, then yeah, we're into perennialism. Exactly. Mr. Anderson, $3. Have you heard of Brother In? Do you have thoughts? I don't have a lot of thoughts on that person or that guy. I've heard of him. Snake Dealer, $1. Do we street preach in Orthodoxy? Nobody in Orthodoxy preaches unless they have the blessing to do so from the hierarchy. So unless you have that blessing to do so from the bishop, no. So thank you guys. If you would, be sure to subscribe to the website or to my Rockfin for the part 2 of this. I have my notes already, but it'll probably be a day or two. By the way, I also have the part 2 of our literary analysis of Wise Blood is ready to go. So I'll probably do Wise Blood tomorrow. I've got tons of interviews coming up. It's going to be a great week. John from Fish Tank will be with us. What else is going on? I can't even remember all the stuff we got going here. Tristan. Beautiful Tristana coming out of temporary internet retirement. I think our rap game was so hard and we ran it so well that we kind of scared Tristan away for a while. But I've got good news. I've talked Tristana into coming back to the game, and we will be doing, you got it, Fight Club. Thursday night with Tristana, Fight Club. Amazing. Can't believe I've never done Fight Club yet, but that'll work out well because, we can do it with Tristan. Obviously, Friday, I'll be with Lord Voldemort, as you guys know. Please tune into that. And then Jamie and I got another great show coming up Saturday night. Now, I don't have high expectations for Indiana Jones and the milking machine of infinite money. I'm joking. That's my franchise milking joke. Indiana Jones, the Dial of Destiny, or AKA the milking machine of infinite franchise glory. We will be doing the new Indiana Jones. Not only that, we will also analyze all of the other Indiana Jones. So you're going to get the first 4. And yes, of course, Crystal Skull's dumb. But we're going to still do it because it'd be funny to make fun of it. And we got pretty deep into Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, and Last Crusade. So I'm sure you guys probably did see Baselit, Analyzer, and Kotel did a Raiders of the Lost Ark analysis, and it was good. Enjoyed their analysis. However, we're going to do the whole thing. Just like we did the whole Bourne thing, and we did the Mission Coon Possible franchise as well. So you're going to get all of Indiana Jones, including the new one. And I think if I just go into it with absolutely no expectations or the expectation that it's going to be awful, maybe it'll be decent. So there's the upcoming stream. And everybody oh, by the way, please go ahead and get your tickets. Last chance, guys. Last chance for seeing us live with Jamie Kennedy in Los Angeles. Get your tickets in the show description for July 6th, Los Angeles. Going to be a blast. Please go get your tickets right there and come out and see us. 5-hour event. A lot of fun. Everybody have a good night.